Welcome to this episode 210 of Europe Calling. In this webinar, we will mostly speak English today. For all German speakers that want to listen to our two amazing interpreters, Ralf and Babette, I will repeat this quickly in German. Ja, hallo auch nochmal jetzt auf Deutsch. Wir sprechen heute vor allem Englisch. Wir haben wieder zwei tolle Dolmetscherinnen, Ralf und Babette. Wenn ihr die deutsche Simultandolmetschung hören wollt, dann klickt ihr einfach unten auf den kleinen Globus in der Menüleiste oder wenn ihr auf einem mobilen Gerät seid, dann unter Mehr und ich poste das jetzt auch nochmal in den Chat, damit ihr das alle habt. Und ich gehe dann wieder ins Englische. So back to English. Let me first welcome our today's guest, Alberto Alemanno. Alberto is Jean Monnet Professor for European Union Law at HEC Paris and the founder of the Good Lobby. He's currently he's in Paris, but currently he's on sabbatical at the Harvard University in the USA as Democracy Fellow at the Harvard Esch Center for Democracy and visiting scholar at Harvard's Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Study at Harvard. What a long title and excellent. So we will definitely also speak about that. Alberto is very outspoken about all things European. If you follow him on social media, you will know. And I'm more than glad to have him here tonight at Europe Calling. It's not the first time Alberto is here, and I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with you, Alberto, and also with all the people in here that want to ask questions and discuss. So some very quick announcements before we start. So as always, at Europe Calling, you can ask your questions and rank or vote your fellow listeners' questions. I will put the link to the Slido question tool we are using in the chat in a second. Please only ask questions there and vote on other questions. With more than 1,000 people wanting to join us tonight, this is the only way we can identify those questions you want to raise. So when you ask your question, please enter a name because I really don't like to struggle with pronouncing anonymous more than once. And as always, Europe Calling will be recorded and put on YouTube and your favorite podcast app afterwards. And that's from my side. And now I hand over to Alberto Alemanno. He will have the room for himself for 25 minutes, and I will get to your questions. And maybe I jump in at some points, but there will be a surprise. And I give the floor to you, Alberto. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Max, for the opportunity to spend some time with the Europe Calling community, which I happen to know. I had the chance to be with you in the past and to discuss a variety of themes. I remember discussing about fossil fuels and the regulation of fossil fuel companies a few months ago and their advertising. But today we are going to take the big view and we're going to be going through basically the last 6-8 months in Europe. It has been a long journey. It took a lot of time to get into a new European government. Can we use this term? A new European administration on this side of the Atlantic. We call it von der Leyen or Fidel 2.0. Very much at the same time in which America is getting Trump 2.0 getting into the White House. So it is there's quite an interesting synchronicity between these two events. And contrary to conventional wisdom, these two individuals and these two administrations might have much more in common than might look like. So it's important, I think, to realize how much convergence there might be across the Atlantic, despite all what we hear about Europe remaining somehow the leader in protecting liberal values. No, if you look at issues ranging from migration, to deregulation and of course climate and the environment, you see much more convergence than divergence across the two sides of the Atlantic. This is just to begin and to be provocative since moment one. What I prepared for you is a sort of timeline analysis of what has occurred in Europe in the past few months. As I said, I'm going to split my presentation in 3 parts. We're going to be looking at what happened before the European elections, the long months we have been waiting before the vote that took place in June. What happened on that day, actually several days, because in Europe we don't vote on the same day. We don't have election day like in the US. And then looking at the after election. It took us a while to get von der Leyen chosen and then elected by the European Parliament, and then having the team of the College of Commissioners being confirmed. This only happened last week, so it's very recent. And on December the 1st, this election started. Most of the information that I'm going to be providing tonight has been published somehow or somewhere. There's a very interesting guidebook we developed called The Road to the 2024 Election with my organization, which is called The Good Lobby. It's a nonprofit committee to equalize access, and really try to provide more information, more intelligence to civil society organization. And the major program we developed over the past few months is called the Good Lobby Hub, where you can find, of course, for free, all sort of information helping citizen movements, residents of Europe, to get a sense of what happens and also organize civil society. So we have been initially unboxing the manifestos, meaning the political agendas of the European political parties. We've been giving them different scores, in this sense, traffic lights, depending on whether they were open in their stance, whether they were open to receiving input. Well, the Greens did a much better job than the EPP, the European Popular Party, in their inclusivity. We measure how open they were to civil society, how interested they were in giving a stance, so somehow being responsive to civil society demands. So you will find a bunch of information there. And then we develop a variety of toolkit elements that try to analyze what was occurring, and also some specific advocacy pills you can find. So basically, the analysis, the diagnostic we made before the elections was pretty much captured in this op-ed. When I wrote that Europe didn't have proper European elections, I've been saying this for many, many years, but I think it's becoming more apparent to many more people that the European elections are nothing else but 27 parallel elections whose results have to be aggregated, to be made sense of, in order to get a sense of what are the European preferences. But obviously, these are not European preferences. These are national preferences that have been aggregated into the national domestic environment, and then artificially put together somehow at the European level. When our elected, all of a sudden, they need to pretend to become European representatives. No, they are national political leaders, because without being selected by a national political party and without going through the national political selection and electoral process, they would not arrive in Strasbourg nor in Brussels. So if you think about it, European elections happen on different days. We have the Belgian people voting already on Thursday, the Dutch voting sometimes on Friday, sometimes on Sunday, some or most of Europeans voting on Sunday. So we don't vote on the same day. We vote for national parties, we vote for national programs, and we vote for national candidates. There are very few non-Germans running in Germany. There are very few non-French running in France for the European Parliament. So much for European politics, right? There's very little European in all of this. And the fact that we don't have a European public sphere that is somehow telling us what's happening in Europe in one way, but only in 27 ways, everything that happens in Europe is narrated through the national prism, depending on the media you follow. So before the elections, we all realized that there was something going on in Europe. We could see this kind of surge of right-wing extremist parties, sometimes in part of the country, like it was the case and is still the case in Germany, or in the old country where they already gained power, like in Italy. For the first time in Europe, we have a far right, meaning a leader of a group which has neo-fascist traditions, joining and leading a government, not only supporting it out from the outside, like in Sweden, but actually being part of the government. We have been seeing a lot of signals, a lot of elements suggesting that these European elections would have become a very, very polarizing moment in which society would have split more than more by expanding the democratic, let's say, electoral capacity of Europe, with a lot of people voting on the right of the EPP, some people voting on the left of the socialists, certainly less, but this was certainly happening. And we expected somehow a political reshuffle, in particular because many parties, more on the right than on the left, they didn't really have a house in Europe. Their allegiance to European political party was not very clear. This is somehow epitomized by Viktor Orban Fidesz party that has been part of the EPP, then it was pushed out, but is still it was a bit in a vacuum. It was not part of any political party. So there was a lot of speculation whether he would have joined Giorgia Meloni's ECR party, the Conservatives, or perhaps started a new political group, what he did together with Marine Le Pen, the Patriots for Europe, and then even the Sovereignists for Europe, with AfD really going to the right. So 3 political groups. So this expectation proved correct. But many other speculation proved extremely wrong. There were these very bombastic headlines. We're getting used to these bombastic headlines by politicals, so we no longer believe into them. But there was this Europe trans moment. People said that the far right, for the first time, together with the EPP, might have gained a political majority in Europe. So for the first time in history, would have seen a shift from centrist party to the right. Well, this didn't necessarily occur in election day. When you look at the breakout of the European Parliament as it looks like today, you clearly see a lot of blue, a lot of dark colors, more than any time before. But clearly, we still see the EPP having a majority with the traditional party, the Socialists, the Liberals, and potentially the Greens. So 2 narratives emerged mid-June. Some people were saying, hey, the far right has really surged, is really big, and it might govern one day. And some people saying or sending a more reassuring message, in particular, outgoing President von der Leyen then saying the center is holding. Yes, it's holding. And both narratives prove partly true. On the one hand, we see a shrinking mainstream party coming together, the traditional coalition of center-right and center-left party somehow commanding a majority, but also seeing many more far rights than in the past, 187 MEPs sitting on the right of the EPP, getting a lot of attention, being split among 3 political groups, but still being a very enticing target, notably for the EPP of Manfred Weber and the EPP of Ursula von der Leyen. When you look this diachronically from 1979, the first time we voted for the European elections, to 2024 in June, you can see that the dark color are really reaching a high record number. So it's well above 50% of the European Parliament, which is on the right, and a shrinking space for the lighter color coming from the Liberals upwards. So this is the smallest center-left or left majority that you could imagine. And in fact, it is not a majority at all. This has become a minority. You can also depict this in a slightly different way. Again, from 1979 to 2024, you see the total far right represent over 27%, so more than 1 MEPs out of 4 belongs to one of the political groups on the right of the EPP. You see the shrinking happening in other political families is pretty manifest for the Greens compared to the previous policy cycle. It is clear also for the Socialists at one glance. So that's basically how the European Parliament looks today, with the far-right groups, the 3 far-right groups comprising many political families then at the national level. And this is basically the composition, a sort of Italian-Polish majority with this most, let's say, moderate far-right group, the ECR, the Conservatives of Europe, which used to be the group of the Brits. The British have established it when joined the European Union. The Patriots for Europe being dominated by Marine Le Pen, which continues to call the shot in France. She just made fall down the French government together with the left, and of course, Viktor Orban, Fidesz. And then the AfD political group in the parliament with some other small groups with very few MEPs on the very right. So the fact there are 3 political parties, of course, are somehow legitimizing even further the ECR, which all of a sudden becomes an acceptable partner for many more political leaders, not only within the EPP, but potentially also among the liberals and perhaps even further to the left. So here it is the ambiguity that start emerging, the fact that von der Leyen was reassuring the traditional parties, the Socialists and the Liberals and the Greens, that there would have been a lot of continuity in the way in which she would have governed, and therefore the mainstream majority that's been governing Europe would have continued, while at the same time flirting with MEPs sitting on the right of the European Popular Party, in particular the ECR, but not only this ECR. We have been seeing meetings between EPP members. We have been seeing a push from the socialists, the liberals, asking the EPP to sign an agreement before the European elections and saying, please commit not to govern and not to accept the support of far-right parties, and the EPP refused to do so. In other words, we have been receiving a lot of signals suggesting that perhaps there was a dual game or a double game that the EPP was doing as a result of the fact that the EPP plus the Patriots, plus the ECR, they didn't have a majority, but when you add all the far right, or at least you add a couple of more of the far right, you could actually receive such a majority. And this ambiguity pushed me to take a very radical stance, which was not really, and continue not to be very popular, which was to vote down von der Leyen as a president-elect. I really thought that she proved who she is. She has been governing for 5 years, but she basically turned her back already 8 months ago in early 2024 to her major legacy, which was the Green New Deal, by boycotting the treatment and even the publication of some of the proposals, by slowing down the acceptance under the pressure of her own party, the EPP. But she needed the EPP support in order to be selected as the next candidate president. That was also written in the German coalition agreement. The Greens could have proposed the commissioner, but only if the outgoing would have left, which wasn't the case. And basically, I was summing up the reason why probably Europe should have moved to another leader, to another candidate, and to have another kind of political dynamics that would have been much more clear-cut than what we envision. I obviously got it wrong, meaning that Ursula von der Leyen managed to bring together a number sufficient for her to be voted, quite high, considerably higher than the previous time. There was over 400 votes in her support, mainly coming from the centrist party, from the EPP all the way to the Greens. The Greens didn't vote for von der Leyen in 2019 when she was proposing the Green New Deal, but they voted in favor of von der Leyen when she was departing from the Green New Deal in July 2024, which was a very interesting event to observe. So we got a sense in July that essentially von der Leyen was committing to continuity. There could have been a few changes along the political priorities, but essentially continuity. She would have not necessarily turned to the right. However, already at the time, it was visible that she was ready to identify an alternative complementary majority, not only the centrist party, but also the center-right or the right when necessary to pass certain policy files that were a bit more conservative. And that's exactly what it has occurred. More recently, when the new European Parliament started working and voting, we could see the European Parliament being pretty much dominated by an incredible right-wing majority going from the very right all the way to the EPP and trying to dilute the deforestation law that was previously passed, delaying even further. And these occur even before on Venezuela, when Edmundo González was recognized in a resolution where all the right together voted together, also on the timetable for commissioner hearings, also on the European budget amendments. This alternative right majority clearly manifested itself in the past few weeks and months. So it's pretty clear that a misalignment was occurring. So in September, October, I wrote this piece, this time to a different audience, and trying to say, hey, the misalignment is emerging. It's pretty clear that for the first time, this new commission won't be rely on the traditional centrist majority that historically has been governing Europe. Europe has been either a bit on the center-right or a bit on the center-left. But this time, we are really seeing an administration which decided, deliberately or not, to rely also on an alternative political majority, which is completely on the right. It was at that time that von der Leyen received the different candidates to become commissioners. So each government had to propose someone. Ursula von der Leyen asked for 2 candidates per country, 1 female and 1 male. You can see the colors here. And it ended up that most of the governments didn't really pay much of attention. They sent a male candidate only, not a female. This has led to a pushback, partly pushback by von der Leyen, and managed to get more or less the appearance of a gender balance commission, which is not necessarily the case. She also proposed a new structure, which caught by surprise many observers, moving towards a system that I define of presidentialization, in which the President of the European Parliament or the European Commission becomes even more important than in the past. Remember that the principle governing the Commission, being the only institution that is committed to identify the European interest, is that each European Commission has the same weight. There is a principle of collegiality. The Commission is supposed to work like a college, where they look for consensus. However, when you look at the structure, it's pretty clear that the new Commission is rather looking in a pretty centralized way. You have these vice presidents that look a bit like soldiers, that they have to keep control of the different commissioners, but virtually the blurring existing among these different portfolios will lead von der Leyen to basically have the final word on many, many issues. So the college is less hierarchical than the previous one, because there are not really commissioners who are more important than others for real. They don't necessarily have these prerogatives, but this has been giving more power to von der Leyen. So these are the candidates. These were the candidates, the so-called commissioners designate, the commission, the government put forward as a future college of commissioner, and all of them went through the scrutiny of the parliamentary committee. And for the first time since 2004, the European Parliament basically validated all of them without raising much of a concern, besides perhaps one exception, who is Mr. Vareli, the government, the Hungarian commissioner, or the commissioner put forward by the Hungarian government, that has been stripped of part of his portfolio, not to be reproductive rights, something that he doesn't consider to be an health issue. So this has been set aside and given to another commissioner. This is a very interesting moment. It has been an interesting moment because the parliament was supposed to verify the suitability of each individual candidate, meaning what expertise this individual has. Does he have any conflict of interest in dealing with this issue? But the parliament, instead of going through an individual assessment, has rather accepted to look at the College of Commissioners as a package. And because of a deal existing between basically the EPP and the S&D, they decided to give up on their veto power and to basically say, let's bring everybody on board, despite the fact that the EPP had some reservations on Ribera, who comes from Spain, the commissioner responsible for climate and competition, and the S&D and the Liberals, and of course the Greens had also had some reservation in relation to Mr. Fitto, who is the other vice president, this time on cohesion, coming from Brothers of Italy, so this neo-fascist party, at least that's his origin, and of course the Hungarian commissioner. There was a deal, there was an exchange, but basically the parliament missed the opportunity to exercise its full prerogative, and it accepted as a package this College of Commissioners, by perhaps forgetting that in the European Union you cannot really call for snap elections. You cannot necessarily call for a new European Commission to be dissolved and to have European. Now for 5 years we are stuck. We are stuck for 5 years. There's no mechanism besides the possibility to introduce a motion against von der Leyen on one of her commissioners in case of ethical misconduct, something that it doesn't happen. In other words, our motion of no confidence vote, our kind of impeachment process, which has never been used, needs 2/3 of the European Parliament, so it will never occur. And it's not really a political instrument. It's not an instrument of political accountability. It's more an instrument that is used to basically verify whether, in case of grave breach, very bad breach of ethical obligations, the parliament can basically raise its voice. Which is the overall context and why this ambiguity was created? Well, in a way, the College of Commissioners, as it has been endorsed by the Parliament, reflects quite accurately what is happening in the capitals of Europe. We have been seeing more and more member states with far-right government. We have never seen so many governments governed by the right. In Europe, more than half of the members of the European Council, more than half of the European Parliament, and a European Commission that currently has 2 members coming from political groups and parties on the right of the EPP. So clearly the EPP is the dominant political force in Brussels, not only in the Commission, not only the Parliament, but also in the Council. And this is something you can see. And certainly also when you look at the nomination in the cabinets, when you look at high-rank officials, also in the administration of the EU, we see a lot of European Popular Party. That basically means that Europe has been turning to the right. This is kind of new because if several member states, as I said, turn to the right, they've been seeing even far-right party governing in Europe. This had not occurred yet at the European level. So Europe, in a way, had been somehow spared by the far-right parties getting into government position, despite having some MEPs in the past, despite having some growing weight. But this has clearly monopolized the political conversation and opened what political scientists call the Overton window. So the things you can say and you can mainstream now are clearly those dictated by the far right. The new European Parliament is the most right-wing in the history. This is the same for the Commission and the Council, and this is something we can see. That means that the centrist majority that has been governing Europe for several decades, it's basically over. This is, from a democratic perspective, something positive because there is more pluralism. The European project is no longer a prerogative of centrist parties on the center left and the center right. It has become also a box that contains voices that are very antagonistic to the very same European integration process. But this is coming with a very high cost because some of these political forces are clearly attacking and challenging the very essence of European integration. Virtually no European country, besides a few individual politicians, are claiming to want to leave, to have their country leaving the European Union, but they want to change the European Union from within. And that's exactly what is happening. The conditions are met to see the nature, the very nature of the European integration process to change as a result of this. And we see a commission that is very much dependent on so many political groups, on so many political parties, that might very much become a transactional entity that has to negotiate every single policy file a bit on the left, a bit on the right, trying to get the center when it's more interesting to it. But certainly that means political volatility, means less political stability, less guarantees of having the political priorities that have been promised to European citizens and to the parliament transform into law. We see more intergovernmentalism and overall a less principled union. A union that seems to be caring about much less about the rule of law, about the red lines that should confine its own operation when it comes to migration, which has clearly become an issue of security, no longer an issue which is humanitarian in nature. So this European Union is clearly looking more hawkish than the one we had before, and also less keen on defending those fundamental values. And in essence, when you look at the political calendar ahead of us, this commission will be serving the whims of the new political leaders getting or remaining into the European Council. Those dominant voices are going to be calling the shots, and this European Commission will become more and more a secretariat of what the head of state and government wants from the European Union, as opposed to be what is supposed to be an independent government of Europe, which has democratic legitimacy coming from the parliament, which is directly elected, and also by the national governments, and basically delivering on a variety of promises she has been making during the electoral campaign. And that's why, final slide, at the Good Lobby, we've been working very hard on this question that is occupying many people at the moment, whether to engage or not to engage with the far right, because this is something that NGOs, civil society, academics, researchers, journalists, citizens will face, because the far right is getting power. And I don't have to explain to a predominantly German audience the dilemma, because this is something you're living and going through in your own country, and is becoming very real day by day. I'm going to stop here, and very looking forward to your own input, questions, and reactions. Back to Max.
Excellent. Thank you, Alberto. Oh, there's so much to discuss. I think I have enough questions just to do it without the audience. We can just chat for an hour, but we won't do that, I promise. And I wanna start with a few direct questions from the audience about details about what you said. So someone asked, what's the difference between a normal commissioner and a vice president? So in terms of responsibilities, duties, and power.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very technical question, but an important one. Over the past 10 years, so basically the Lisbon Treaty, this idea of creating a bit of a hierarchy among commissioners emerged. There's a reference in the treaty to the possibility of having a vice president. At the time was one. It was one individual supposed to basically become the right hand of the president. Somebody would have substituting the president in his absence when he was traveling or she was traveling, and not necessarily having more policy portfolio competence. It was more like an administrative duty, a replacement. But then when we look back at 2019, what happened with von der Leyen, number one, we saw a clear attempt that already Selmayr, the chief of staff of Juncker, tried to do, of creating different clusters among commissioners so as to have some order. And the original scene of all of this is that since 2001, the number of commissioners should be lower than the number of the member states. That's what the Lisbon Treaty said in 2001. However, every 5 years, the leaders, our head of state and government in the council, they decide to depart, meaning to disregard that norm and to say, no, each government is going to put forward a commissioner. And this has created the need to somehow create clusters and hierarchies, because otherwise it's very difficult, or at least proven very difficult, for the president to organize the work existing among those portfolios. And it's a very difficult puzzle also to make it happen, to make it work. And now we see that the final result is to basically take away this executive power that many vice presidents had in the previous von der Leyen commission, to duplicate their number. Now there are 6, it's many, right? And then to basically create portfolios that are so blurred among them that you will need somebody to basically define where the line has to be drawn. And this is not very clear today. Only the practice will prove that. The only element of reference is how many DGs, how many Director General report to that particular commissioner. And I really struggle to see why certain commissioners should be super commissioner nowadays. I rather see that some portfolio are more politically salient than others, perhaps because of the competences the union might have. It is pretty clear that the union has more competence in trade than in education and culture. No doubt about this, but the way in which they've been organized is not entirely clear and entirely convincing. I remember that the principle of collegiality should be the principle governing the way in which the commission works. So all commissioners have a say in all decisions, because those are taken together every single week.
Yeah, I mean, one of the very interesting bits, and when we just stay with the topic of executive vice presidents and vice presidents generally. So we had the Fito, first time a far right party sending a commissioner, and being that's not true, a vice president in that case. And so especially, as you mentioned, the Greens, but also the Renew and so Liberals, as well as Social Democrats, really tried to to kind of reduce it's his importance and the task and everything. So do you, when you compare how he went in, so Fito went into this process and after the hearings, do you actually see some changes? Because I heard, especially from the Greens, that we managed to take some, so we the Greens just managed to take some of the responsibilities away to make him a bit less harmful. Do you see it the same way, or how do you look at it?
I think the devil lies in the detail. We're going to see how the services are going to be responding to the cabinet and how much Fito will like to fully embody his own prerogative. So I think only the practice will tell us. I don't see major changes or many guarantees that have been offered in the way in which he will be basically running the show when it comes to social cohesion funds, a variety of funds that basically aim at redistributing wealth. And, it comes from a region that has been greatly benefiting from those funds, which is called Apulia, and is currently under investigation for a couple of civil cases there. So if the parliament had done its work properly, notably the legal service, not the legal service, but the legal parliamentary committee, the URI committee had done its job, this issue would have popped up. And incredibly and surprisingly for many Italians who knows about the fact that there is a pending case on Mr. Fitto, this issue didn't emerge. So possibly this was part of the political deal among political parties, again, to pass everybody through because this was the only way to avoid a political impasse, which would have delayed the entry into service of this commission. And this, I think, is something we should criticize. It's really a missed opportunity for the European Parliament to exercise its full prerogatives.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to what happened there, maybe you can explain a bit more about the power dynamics within those hearings, because I remember the socialists, you mentioned her trying to protect Teresa Ribera, which is kind of the number two of von der Leyen now when it comes she's probably the highest executive, at least they want to as they want to portray it, the highest executive vice president with a very big portfolio. So what was it about Ribera and Fito? And I mean, Fito is not EPP, right? He's even from like a different party. So how did the EPP behave in those hearings and the socialists in terms of around those figures?
Well, I think the story is quite simple. It's the story of national politics intruding into European politics. As I said, all these individuals have a national political story because that's how you become a European politician. You need to run at the national level, and all of them, they have their own stories. So when the mainstream parties, notably the socialists and the liberals, start raising concerns about Mr. Fitto coming from Brothers of Italy, raising concerns about Mr. Varela coming from Hungary, very close to Mr. Orban, this was the time in which the response, in particular of the EPP, much more than from Giorgia Meloni, was that Ms. Ribera, so the socialist that was supposed to get, let's say, the best portfolio, the most generous portfolio, and becoming even the vice president of the European Commission, should have also been subject to scrutiny because she sits in a government that has been challenged for mishandling what happened in Valencia. So this natural disaster that occurred, there's a current debate, legal debate by now, is no longer a public debate, it's become a legal contestation on who was responsible for that. Was it the local government or was it the central government? And this issue remain open, it's very contested. But basically what the EPP has been arguing was that perhaps it was in the best interest of the center left to move on Fitto and on Farelli, because if they had exercised some forms of pushback, well, the EPP would have basically stopped Ribera. And they were very close to veto Ribera and to ask the Spanish government to actually replace it. And at the time, Mr. Sanchez, the prime minister, being basically the only socialist remaining, we don't know for how long, in the European Union as a head of state, with some weight, he clearly said that no, there was no way he would have replaced it. And there, the deal was basically done, right? We're going to push everybody in it. We're going to make a few change in the tweaks. Everybody's going to get into his job by December 1st, and that's exactly what happened. But it was not a very pretty show. It was really a clear horse trading. that very few people care about in Europe, but still, again, this commission is there to stay for 5 years, and we're giving full trust to a college of commissioners that has received a very low number. This is something I haven't highlighted in the presentation, but very few votes were given of difference between those who supported the entire College of Commissioners and those who voted against. And we also know, when you look at who voted for, that basically this new commission is more supported by the right than by the center left. So de facto, we got an endorsement of the college, which is relying on a very different majority, much more to the right, than the majority that initially, individually, von der Leyen got in July. So it's pretty clear that something has changed politically.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So the EPP pushing Fito as ECR candidate, and at the end of the day, for the confirmation of the commission, but also in the other votes, for example, when it came to the final vote, the ECR was not standing behind von der Leyen in a big number. So kind of they protected Fito, but at the end of the day, von der Leyen would not have been, or the von der Leyen commission, like last week or the week before, would not have been confirmed without the Greens actually going in there and supporting her with half of their votes, right? So it wouldn't have been enough, because ECR, even though they got a vice president and Fito got protected by the EPP, didn't vote, and like I think probably a third of them actually voted for von der Leyen at the end. So that was actually not enough to get her over the line without the Greens. So it's interesting. So that's I'm wondering what you think about the EPP, and maybe you can talk about them a bit, because how I see it, and I also see in the questions, EPP is not EPP. I mean, it's a big group. There's like a person like Manfred Weber from the CSU here in Germany. A lot of them know him, and the party. They're far right. I mean, they are populist. Right? They are conservative right populists. And on the other hand, there's someone like von der Leyen, who's more like from the Merkel wing of the CDU, which is much more closer to the Greens and the Liberals than actually probably to Manfred Weber. So how's the situation there? There was this power struggle also between von der Leyen and Manfred Weber before the election. So can we speak about the EPP, or should we also look at kind of what's going on in the party?
Political groups in the European Parliament have always been loose federation of national parties, which are ideologically very heterogeneous. We have never been seeing homogeneous political groups. They are much more homogeneous on the extremes, so more on the left, more on the right, than on the center left and center right. The liberals have always been one of the most, let's say, colorful groups, because you have really different people having a different understanding of the world, of government, of society, of business. And this is the case certainly for the EPP, which is not a monolith. And this is the case for the ECR, as the vote on von der Leyen proved. And remember that, again, in July, ECR voted abstain on von der Leyen. So there was no real desire to actually go for this commission. And you can see that there was a sequencing, very strategic, in which Meloni, as a leader of the ECR, wanted to get full leverage, because she might have realized that her vote would have made a difference. And not all the ECR follow, because, again, they have different ideas. And this shows all the ambiguity, the political ambiguity upon which this commission relies today. We cannot identify the parliamentary majority supporting this commission. Of course, the EU is not a parliamentary majority system as we have in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Slovenia. We don't have this. But historically, the commission always had a sort of clearly defined number of political groups and parties and votes supporting its proposal. When you look historically at where the votes were going, it was a very, very swift shift, like a little pendulum, depending on the policy file. But here, we are really getting this very, very range number of potential supporters that they are going to basically turn the European Commission into a machine that says, we're going to write this proposal for the center left. We're going to write this proposal for the center right, with no guarantee that this is going to happen. So this is going to create a lot of volatility. 95% of the proposals coming from the Commission becomes law. 95%. This has been the case in the past 30, 40 years. But all of a sudden, this might no longer be the case, because we're going to have a parliament much more antagonistic, uh, discussing, debating at all levels, proposing a variety of amendments, and perhaps having this file not making it through, because in the past we had these trialogues where, you know, representatives of the parliament, representatives of the council and the commission come together. But will the trialogues deliver in this new political climate? I think this is a big question to be asked.
Mm. And I'm bringing in here Luke. Luke asks, what do you see happening in the next 3 to 5 years? And you alluded to that already, but I'm wondering whether what you're describing, this very loose kind of, you know, majority there, majority here, whether, you know, after a few more disappointments you know, by the ECR, because, you know, it's you said, so ECR has in the past also not fully supported von der Leyen, and every time Weber tried to make a majority with them, that kind of worked for a essentially for a smaller motion. But when it came to the final vote, actually, so for an amendment it worked, and for the final vote they broke away. So do you think there's a possibility that, you know, when they do that 10 times, Weber's strategy will just, you know, go away and they will return to the democratic platform? Or do you really see like the next 5 years of just, you know, wishy-washy here and there?
Well, the worst case scenario is the risk of alienation, meaning that both the left and both the right are going to be alienated by the fact that we are going to have this commission instrumentalizing their votes. But obviously, the center left, the mainstream parties are much more sensitive to be instrumentalized than the right. So the worst case scenario is that we are going to shifting away from the traditional majority into a right-wing alternative majority in which there might be an alignment between EPP and the new power coming in. You know, we all know that the French elections are certainly going towards that direction, even the presidential election in 2 years' time. We can see this happening in many other European countries. And then we have the variable of the Trump administration and how Europe will react to the Trump administration. And as I anticipated, I see much more convergence between this new political climate in Europe and the US than what many people would like to admit. So there is a risk that this alternative majority to the right will actually permeate the entire European Commission political priorities, in particular because in this geopolitically shattered world, we're going to see much more crises, emergencies, in which political leaders are going to come together in these summits till 3, 4, 5 o'clock at night and simply say the commission, you have to do this, this, and that, regardless of what the treaty says, regardless of what the red lines are actually providing them. So we can expect more of this reactive commission, and that's possibly why von der Leyen is considered to be a good president, because she has been able to deliver for the head of state and government. But does this delivery also deliver for European citizens? I don't think so. And that's where the democratic legitimacy of this parliament and this commission can be a big question, right? Because we don't really understand what's the connection between our vote in the European election and the political color and direction of this commission. There's no real clear, readable link between those two. So you might push it further and say, why should we vote in 2029, right? If our vote does not define the political direction of the EU.
Let's come to the question of elections in a second. I want to read something from Thomas Schneider, who pushes back a bit, or asked at least, regarding your comparison between von der Leyen and Donald Trump. So he says basically, so what's the purpose of that provocation? I think that is one question, but then he goes on with, in the EU, there are checks and balances provided by the Council and DEP, whilst the control instrument in the US will hardly be exerted by a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. So does the EU actually have the better checks and balances?
Well, perhaps let me go slightly deeper on my point about the convergence existing today between the two administrations across the Atlantic. It might be a bit difficult to fully accept that there might be such a convergence. But if you think about what happened in Europe on migration, we're not talking about a full deportation like Mr. Trump says, because there are no Trumpian politicians among European leaders today, besides perhaps Viktor Orban, who is the outgoing chair of the European Council. but of the Council of the EU, of Minister of the Council of the EU. But the discussion about return hubs and what Meloni has been doing in Albania and all what we have been doing with our migration policy of basically externalizing the security of the frontiers and thinking about this and endorsing these return hubs is not so dissimilar. It's a matter of perhaps degree, but essentially we are looking at migrants through a very similar lens. When it comes to the climate, what is happening, the turning our back to the Green Deal and basically questioning policies that have already been adopted, the ban on combustion engines, it was a closed deal, 2035. But the same von der Leyen has been campaigning by saying this is not going to happen because the German automotive industry and others don't want this. So in a way, this is a form of departing from those very same goals. And then finally, there is this ethos of deregulation, which is very much present in the very famous or unfamous Draghi report, which basically correlates our lack of productivity in Europe to this excessive regulation, which is creating undue pressure on European industry. And this deregulatory stance is basically what Trump is trying to do with Elon Musk in this dodgy, with this Department of Government Efficiency, which is not really a department, it's like a task force. It would be wonderful to have a department so that Elon Musk should divest from all his companies, comply with all this integrity, but he's not. But the rhetoric of deregulation is very similar. So when you put together migration, climate and degreening of current policies that is happening in Europe, and then you add up this further deregulation across the board, I think it's very plausible to argue that these two administrations might have more in common than they have not in common. When it comes to the checks and balances, are we really sure that in Europe there could be checks on the emergence of this alternative far-right majority? I don't think there are so many checks. If the European Parliament is going to be voting what the Commission is proposing, and this is a Commission very much on the right, 14 members, 14 commissioners are from the EPP, and then there are two more, one from Borders of Italy and another one from the Patriots. They have a majority. They can pass through a lot of proposals there without any problem, and the Parliament can rubber stamp them. Yeah. And pass, and these are going to become into law. So I don't see many checks and balances. In the same way, I see very little checks and balances in the US when it comes to the trifecta, the fact that there is a full power across the different judiciary, executive, and legislative at the moment. So again, I see more parallelism than differences, unfortunately. I wish I could argue the opposite.
Mm. So, you spoke about the pushback for Green Deal and climate and diversity protection. Well, we already saw that in the outgoing parliament, but now in the new parliament with different majorities, that's probably even got to increase. And we have a question from Carla Schulte-Dick-Fischedek. She asked, how can we ensure that the Green Deal and climate and biodiversity protection do not suffer a setback?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between the laws, regulation, and directives that have already been approved, and the implementation of those. And the new game will be basically preserving those laws and regulation that have to be implemented, but now we see them reopened. CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, deforestation law, which has been delayed 1 year. We see the protection of wolves also disappearing for a variety of reasons. And then the implementation. So the next game in town for the next 5 years will be adopting the so-called non-legislative acts. These are a bunch of hundreds and hundreds of measures that are adopted on a weekly basis to actually give meaning and operationalize all these important pieces of regulation we have adopted over the past 5 years. And that's where the game will be. And this requires most of the time the European Commission to act, notably on delegated acts. They really have, and then we have the working committees. And in average in Europe, we adopt 50, 60 legislative acts per year, and we adopt over 2,000 non-legislative acts. So we had to focus more on this if you want to get a sense of whether we are going to be able to preserve the Green Deal and to actually make it happen, because at the moment they look very ambitious pieces of legislation which had very limited impact. And when we try to extend these requirements to the agricultural sector, well, you all remember what happened in January, February, when basically the very same commission, the EPP, they basically give up and they gave much more than what the farmers they asked for, because they had very little reasons to actually claim that the Green Deal was applicable to them, because basically there was no provision applicable to them that would have changed their conditions. They had a very long list of complaints. Some of them were legitimate, but they were not related to that. They were basically saying that they are squeezed by the market power of supermarkets and retailers. Well, we have been knowing this for 15 years, and the Commission is pretty much an accomplice to that. So it was not a Green Deal backlash at all.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think you make an important point, and I think you know, and the audience knows, probably also worked in the European Parliament, and those implementation. Um, so the implementation of all of it and what the commission actually is doing by themselves based on the legislation they have is so super important. It's so important also to change things. So, but if we both agree on that, then you could probably argue that I'm coming back to the Greens here because you've criticized them so much. So I'm trying to push back a bit, and their strategy. I mean, if you look at their press releases, supporting von der Leyen. Their strategy is basically to say, look, we have to support von der Leyen, we have to support the good people in the EPP. They are not all Manfred Webers, they're also good people in the EPP. So we have a majority in the parliament with the good people of the EPP, and we have a good relationship with von der Leyen, so that as Greens, as Liberals, as Social Democrats, we can actually influence the von der Leyen Commission in a positive way to implement all the good things that happened in the last 5 years. I mean, Green Deal was amazing. I mean, what has been achieved by the Green Deal is outstanding. It's probably historical. So that's the argument. What do you think? So do you see some merit in it?
Well, I think the big question is, what is the best way to ensure the legacy of the Green Deal coming from the previous college to actually be operationalized? What is the most effective way? Do you really need to be in opposition to make it work, or do you really have to be in government and to be supportive? I'm not entirely bought by the argument that you need to get along well with von der Leyen to adopt delegated acts and implementing measures. I think you can stay in the opposition to do our work, and then just influencing the different representatives from the different governments that sit in those committees, and to get approved what has to be approved. So it's not very much dependent on your loyalty. I think the Greens could have afforded to show less loyalty to power and speak truth to power, and rather make their support conditional upon a day-to-day request, as opposed to give a blank check, as they have done. This is a blank check. You have allowed this new commission that we don't like, which they don't like. I don't think any Green like this commission. It's impossible, and its members, instead of being part of this mechanism, because then you're going to be associated to that. You're going to be considered to be one of those supporting this college, and therefore being also associated to this possible shift to the right, which is already occurring. So this is very difficult to explain also to your constituencies, right? Why are you doing it? Was it possible to have the same influence while staying outside? It's an empirical question. I argue that yes, it would have been possible, and perhaps it would have been more effective.
Yeah. Or you're wrong. We will see.
I hope to be wrong.
We will see. We all don't know. I mean, it's interesting, the whole discussion about this, because I mean, at the end of the day, it's a general question about how to deal with the far right, especially in a situation where you have conservatives being so split. So where you have one part of the conservatives more tilting towards the right and the other. So what is the role of the other democratic parties? That's, I mean, to get their points across and to keep their influence. I think it's a general question about that. So we will see how it pans out. It's definitely very interesting to watch. And so, speaking of watching and going back into the question, so when we go a bit back to the election and what happened afterwards, so we have the top question now is from someone who didn't give a name, so I have to invent one. What has been an alternative to von der Leyen? Was there one? And I think that's actually very much related to the question that Gaetan van Lokeren from University of Liège is asking. He asked, Dear Alberto, on the dangerous democratic recession, what are your views on key conditions of success for Democrats willing to contribute to revert the trend in 5 years? The attention given to the autocratic appeal seems larger than the one given to building a new democratic appeal. So looking in the next, what in 5 years we might end up at the same situation. So how can we do it differently? We can also speak about who could have been an alternative for von der Leyen, but I rather look ahead and think, when we are in the situation in 5 years' time, well, what is the better strategy and what needs to change?
The European project has always fallen in love with this idea of there is no alternative, right? Tina. It's always Tina, right? There's no option. It's von der Leyen. It has to be von der Leyen. And as a European citizen, I refuse that. I think there were many alternatives, but just we didn't want to give it a chance to other alternatives to emerge. We need to be much more creative. We need to be much braver in thinking about alternatives, alternative coalitions, alternative political forces, alternative political parties. Those voices simply are not there. So in Europe, we are a bit either complacent or we just accept the status quo. We like incrementalisms. What is going to happen now? Well, I think there is a risk that the very essence of the European project will be affected, because we are moving away from supranationalism, this idea that there are institutions capable of identifying the European general interest, not only the Commission, and telling us what is best, and having countries giving up a bit, but also gaining a bit, towards a system of pure intergovernmentalism in which the head of state, having possibly the louder voice, are going to be calling the shots and asking the Commission to deliver for here and for there in the most let's say in the least coordinated fashion. And this is dangerous because this means there is no vision, there's no design, there's no vision of where Europe could be. At least in the outgoing Commission, there was this idea of making Europe a very competitive region in the world, striking a balance between decarbonization and having this social Europe. But now we don't have this vision. There's no vision at all in this College of Commissioners. It's about being ready to be reactive to the crisis of the moment. And this might lead us to basically erode the very same foundations of the EU when it comes to rule of law, when it comes to the rules of the game. We're going to set a lot of precedents in which intergovernmentalism primes over any other forms of community method coming together for the greater good. And this might potentially either satisfy the electorate by delivering a lot, or might actually really alienate the electorate. And this will depend much more on national politics than on European politics. And this is my source of frustration as somebody who believes and feels very European, not only Italian and Spanish because that's where I live, or French because that's where I work. So, I would expect Europe to have a say in the European political process, to have a say, instead of having, the chances of my kids being determined by the constellation of national political leaders agreeing or disagreeing on a matter. That's what I refuse as a way of developing our shared experience of life today. And to respond to Gaetan, what can we do? Well, we need to remain very vigilant and to monitor what is happening. And when you look at the story of the rule of law erosion, one of the reasons why the Commission, even with Juncker, all the way to von der Leyen, has been very reticent to go after Hungary, Poland, and many other countries that would have deserved at the time, perhaps not to the same extent, was the fact that they didn't feel that the European citizens were necessarily on board. They felt that they were a bit alone. This was a bit of a state-to-state issue, was an institution against a government. But what if more Europeans would have become aware that changing reproductive rights in Poland is affecting virtually all Europeans across Europe? What if more Europeans would have realized that reducing judicial independence in Poland or in Hungary or media freedom is affecting all Europeans? What if these forms of expression and protest and cross-border solidarity would have emerged? Perhaps the Commission would have felt much more emboldened to exercise its prerogatives, which is to think in European terms. And without this Europeanization of the political experience of life, we cannot expect the EU to do its job as it is supposed to do. Because again, it's all about making the maths, about how many votes do we get once we put together the national political system coming together. In other words, without more political integration, we are not going to be able to deliver on all the promises we keep making to the citizens, notably those coming from the Mario Draghi report. How paradoxical, right? That the best ideas today, they come from two technocratic reports, the Letta report and the Draghi report. That's where the ideas are. They don't come from citizen movements. They don't come from non-profits, from civil society, from political parties. They come from two technocrats. This is something that, again, I think partly respond to what we should do with Gaetan.
Concretely, what would you say, because, we always have, before every election, we have kind of the discussion about Spitzenkandidaten, like leading candidates. Von der Leyen was the leading candidate, but was not even a candidate. You couldn't vote for von der Leyen in Germany, for example. So there you have the argument Spitzenkandidat, and you have the transnational list as the two kind of, for the federalists, this is really, really like the two main points. But when you refer to Draghi and Letta, so what are you, or what would be the best concrete steps to actually create this, European feeling, the European politicization of it?
I find it very difficult to believe that after 70 years of unprecedented socioeconomic integration, in which we as Europeans, we share so much and we have so many opportunities, we don't have an equivalent level of integration at the political level. So the fact that we are still voting for our European representatives, sometimes in our region, to me doesn't make any sense, right? You can potentially reconcile some local voting with some European-wide college, like transnational list, and just getting this system adapted and to make it evolve. So creating an electoral competition across board, I think would make a huge difference. Having European-wide referenda or preferenda, so asking questions to all citizens of Europe at the same time. We never tried. Should Europeans support the Ukrainian war and the Ukrainians? Should Europeans buy armaments together? Should Europeans buy vaccines together? We don't ask these questions. Switzerland proved, at very smaller scale, that some forms of direct democracy, when well-informed and well-presented, could actually deliver legitimacy for governments. But we can think, much beyond that. We can think about creating genuine political parties at the European level. So allowing people to, as a citizen, you as a German, me as an Italian, to become an individual member of a European political party. This is something that is basically virtually impossible. So if we politicize and Europeanize our experience at the European level, I think we could get much more responsiveness from the political system. You need to change the rules of the game to then have political parties following and the media following, and then it's going to be very, very fast. And that's basically the story that those who theorize European integration thought in the 50s. The very founders, Ernst Haas, these people who talk about neo-functionalism, they realized that at some point, Europe, by delivering to the citizens, would have shifted their allegiances from the national to the European Union, while combining the two. But this Europeanization didn't occur. It was interrupted. Why? Because our national political leaders and parties, they hijacked the process. Europe was supposed to be democratic. It was very little democratic at the beginning because there was this permissive consensus, but it was a temporary solution. Then Europe should have been democratized. But this is exactly what it didn't occur. But it would have occurred if at every single historical juncture, our national political leaders would have not stopped that process. The European Parliament already voted 3 or 4 times on a new electoral law. We still vote basically with the electoral law of the 70s. How can you explain this? We should have 15 or 13 European commissioners since 2001, but every single time they come together, they don't even respect what they wrote in the treaty in 2001. I can keep going, but the original recipe is very different than what we see unfolding. And this to me is a bit of a source of frustration. So there are many good ideas coming from the past that we have not even tried to implement.
I mean, one, we know we are kind of both involved in it. a bit is, also ideas of more deliberation by citizens, like the Democratic Odyssey, for example. The people that are here know about the project, about a transnational citizens assembly. So I agree there are many ways to kind of get citizens, or many good ideas to get citizens involved, getting closer. But then look, when you say like, have more decision-making processes, have more deliberation by citizens, then I look at Romania, for example. What has happened just now there, an extreme right, Putin-friendly presidential candidate has catapulted to the first place in the presidential election by a massive TikTok campaign. So, I'm a bit worried, to be honest. And when we do that, we first have to fix a few things, and that's, for example, the influence of digital platforms and foreign powers on our democracy. So my question to you would be: is actually, is the European democracy resilient enough for more direct democracy, for more deliberation?
Well, it's an excellent question. I think the European Union has been making itself more vulnerable to these kind of episodes by letting politics be only a national affair. If European politics would be also European, as we have, antitrust, trade, and many other competencies which have been Europeanized, Europe gain more power, more resilience, more resources, a better understanding of what is at stake. And that's why I think Citizens Assembly is a great idea. I'm a big fan of the Democratic Odyssey. I've been working in the preparation with Calypso Nicolaides over the years. And I think we should experience more of those. We should use both the electoral channels and the participatory channels to create this kind of antidote, this kind of immunity system of the European Union, and changing a bit our democratic routine. So in a way, Europe is depriving itself of the possibility to receiving a democratic legitimacy from its own people, by basically confining itself to the nation state all the time and just being very, very hesitant in embracing cross-border European-wide experiences. What I like about the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was a very tiny exercise that affected very few people, was its proof of concept. The fact that for the first time, the people who got involved in that process were not the usual suspects, right? There were people who never took the time to think or had the opportunity to think about Europe or feeling European. It was like a mini Erasmus for my uncle and for my cousin who don't speak English, but they were able, across a few days, spread across a few months, to actually experience Europe. And what they asked was nothing federalist. They simply asked, we want to understand more about what happens in Europe, how decisions are taken, at which level and how. And this desire, this thirst to understand how decisions affecting their life and their family, I think is a legitimate request, but they were not federalists. They were not saying we want to have a transnational list per se, but they realized that some mechanisms like those, or having some more European public sphere, would help them to understand and to unpack a bit better how their lives are finally defined and decided. And quite frankly, let's say it is virtually impossible to say how citizens today are shaping the direction of the European Union. The citizens' voice remain pretty much marginalized, and it has been the case for the last 70 years. In this situation, it becomes less and less sustainable because the European Union is supposed to do more and will be reacting more to the crisis of the moment, but this won't be accompanied by an expansion of the opportunity of participation. Rather the opposite. We see a bit of a shrinking space. We see very little discussed about institutional reform, about electoral reform. Nobody wants to talk about this. But in reality, if we don't talk about this before making a quantum leap in perhaps defense integration, how can these new decisions be legitimated? How can we do more Draghi and more Letta without having the people on board? I think this is the difficult question to be asked today.
Mm. Yeah, and then at the same time, I completely feel that, and I feel that when, as Europe calling, we're trying in a way, our founding myth is a bit about, as is for the good lobby, is about also creating a bit of this European public sphere, and as how important that is. And every time you get actually citizens from different countries into a room together, really magic happens. I mean, people that would never meet suddenly meet, and they find similarities. They start to feel European. I mean, it's really great, and then. And I think in a way, a lot of when people are hesitant of feeling European, because then they hear about something, people tell them, look, you don't understand Europe. Europe is too complicated. Europe is too closed. It's too intransparent. And I just want to for everyone, one news of today, for example, that now the European Parliament actually achieved that 1,100 additional Commission manager roles need to publish their lobby meetings, right? So there is actually, so sometimes it feels when we have those discussions that it's only going in one direction, but actually sometimes it's also improving. So in terms of transparency, I always found that the European Parliament, for example, is the most transparent parliament we have on this planet. I mean, this is things you can't do in the Bundestag that you can actually do in the European Parliament, for example.
Absolutely, absolutely. As you know, I've been spending the last probably 20 years evangelizing Europeans, and many people look at me like if I were very naive, saying, the European Union provides you as a citizen, as a resident, many more opportunities than your nation state. There are public consultations, there's a petition system, there are complaints, there are ECIs. The problem with these channels of participation is they are very little known, very little used. Sometimes they're abused by special interests and lobbies, so they don't really have a great, let's say, visibility. Sometimes they backfire, and sometimes they're not taken into account seriously by the European Union themselves. But the reason for that is that we didn't experiment them enough. So since 2012, we had 100 ECIs, European Citizen Initiatives, right? 100. We are 450 million. How would it look like if we had introduced 100,000 ECIs or 1 million ECIs? Well, the institutions would have to react and prepare the right administration. The political parties would pick their ideas from the citizens as opposed to pick ideas from Mario Draghi and Folletta. But this critical mass of ideas and mobilization has not really happened, also because, this is my theory that I still have to prove, because of the lack of political will of national leaders to actually Europeanize the political space. They're a bit afraid that if they let it go, well, somebody else is going to take control, and it's going to be very disruptive. If you share power, somebody lose power. Somebody gain power, somebody lose power. And these power-shifting reforms are not something that Europe has experimenting in the past. So it's terra incognita. But it can only be driven by people mobilizing across borders because they might have similar interests. And here is the other myth that I think has to be debunked. The people saying to me, but the cross-border citizens, the mobile citizens of Europe are all, blue collar, they're all white collars, they are professor, academics, media, and bankers. When you look at data, it is not the case. Those who are actually benefiting from Europe in terms of job opportunities, the critical mass of them are blue-collar workers, nurses coming from the south of Italy, getting a job in Baden-Württemberg, and the Poles, of course, in Ireland, and vice versa. This is the kind of Europe we don't want to see. We haven't reached such a critical mass, but you have over 20 million people mobile across Europe. They are not very politically representative. They're not very mobilized. They're not very self-aware. But, if the Romanian community in the north of Italy would ever organize, they could become, could be the mayor of Milan, right? There are so many, but they are not really visible.
We did a webinar on the European right to associate, which is also because there are no European associations by law, right? And then we talked about this also a lot about cross-border communities is also something hopefully that will go on in the next commission. So I want to invite everyone to raise their hand if you want to ask them oral questions in the last 10 minutes. And while you find the raise hand button, I will just come back to what you said, Alberto, that take back a bit of the national and Europeanize. And then if you look, Ismail asking that, Ismail Bugaba asked, could the current conjunctural weakness situation of both the French and the German government benefits von der Leyen and give her more agency in exercising her power? So it's kind of, an artificial situation where national nation states gets less power. And then I see the tweet of von der Leyen this morning arriving in Brazil to sign Mercosur. So what do you know? Is that kind of a confirmation?
It's a fantastic counterfactual. I mean, we never experienced this before, to have both France and Germany a bit blocked, a bit stopped, a bit handicapped politically, and to see what the European institutions are doing. And you're right, the Mercosur story is a story where apparently the French veto seems a bit less of a veto now. So there is a bit of a window of opportunity. I don't think this commission is fully ready to take full advantage of this possibility. I rather see this commission hoping there will be other national leadership, let's say Donald Tusk in Poland, bringing together this coalition of the will in order to support Ukraine, rather than being von der Leyen herself, having the ability, the vision, and the political bravery to take the lead. But, the jury is still out. Hopefully, we're going to see more initiatives and leadership being shown by the new von der Leyen Commission. Let's hope so. But this is not necessarily what has been happening in the past previous years. It was more national leaders coming up with ideas, including Next Generation EU or joint procurement. These are all ideas that have been concocted in the national capitals, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in some other countries, but not necessarily in the Berlaymont.
Yeah. So we're going to take 3 oral questions. We're going to take them all at the same time, and then we go through them. So first is Laura, or Laura Bow. Laura, you should be able to unmute yourself now. It's also a horrible question, a horrible term, unmuting, but this is the new age. Laura, okay, Laura is trying to unmute herself. No, now I think that was a wrong hand. That's all right. So we try with Eva Lichtenberger. Eva, should be able to unmute yourself now. While you're trying this, I'll give the word to Negar Riahi. Negar, I've seen you've written many written questions. Please unmute yourself and only ask one.
Am I activated? Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you, Negar. Negar, we can hear you.
It is me, yes.
Yes, do you want to ask a question?
I have to ask you something. Hello. This time I have been fighting 35 years via studies in Sweden, been retired, coming up again. And so I have been creating an innovation to change the world of misery. It is because of dental technology is not seen in Sweden or in other countries. That is creates a sustainable life for everybody, and that is the solution of how you can manage peace on earth with that. So that's not so strange for me that's been studying that, but the other people who stop the development and have no connection to dental technology and thinks it is expensive, that is the wrong direction. But now the technology in the world should be supported via political activities, perhaps to be sustained. How can you support so much ideas online that connect the world? Okay.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Gonna take Eva. Eva also found her mic. Eva, please.
Yes. Do you hear me right
yes,
now?
We hear you well.
Okay. Fine. So as an ex-member of the European Parliament, I was always very happy that the parties or the political groups there do not vote in a bloc. So I think one of the strategies could also be for the smaller parties or for the left side of the plenary to address one by one of, let's say, kindly-minded people within the EPP and create new majorities that way. Do you think this will be possible? Because I was also wondering, I didn't watch all the votes now after the elections, but do we see changes in the sense if the political families vote more as a bloc or less as a bloc as before?
Thank you, Eva. And then final question is from Eleonora Heilmann. Eleonora, please. Eleonora, you should be able to unmute yourself now. Okay, no, she's struggling with it. And then I would say, looking at the time, we're just waiting. Now Eleonora found her mic. Eleonora, we should be able to hear you now if you speak.
Hello?
Yeah? Eleonore, wir können dich hören. Hi.
Ja, hallo, ich bin Eleonore Heilmann aus Deutschland.
Hello,
Und
Eleonora Heilmann from Germany. For quite a while, I'm watching Japan.
Therapie, was viele abschreckt, für
Japan has
nachwachsende Zähne.
a certain therapy for third teeth. This is something that we also have in Germany. And for dentists, we have heard an announcement, a communication, and in Japan in September, the 2 to 6-year-olds, all the research has been done on this topic, and also people over 50 are included. The thing is that I have a toxic disease, I wrote on it too, but it's something that also of importance internationally. We also have an international exchange with several patient groups and researchers, and something which is not said very often. I have not many teeth anymore, and my dentist doesn't know why. I went to also private doctors and
Hast du eine
orthodontists.
konkrete Frage? Genau.
Yeah, but do you have a concrete question, Eleonore? Eleonore, do you have a concrete question?
Gerade, ob ich das lauter stellen kann.
I'm looking whether I can hear you.
Hast du eine konkrete Frage noch an ihn?
Augment the volume. Ja, you have a concrete question, Eleonore.
Es sollte europäisch, also ich
yes,
geben.
There should be a European party, I think. That wouldn't be bad. I'd find it very good, and that would be my statement.
Okay. Danke, Eleonore.
Thank you, Eleonore.
Da unterstützen sollte.
And the European Party, which advocates for supporting Japan in this respect.
Okay.
Kinder hatten.
Okay, so I needed to cut Eleonore off here because we're running out of time. I'm sorry, Eleonore, but I think we got your we got your question. So 3 questions. Reha, I think, asked more in the direction of the function of technology in democracy. So new technologies used for democracy, which is I think an exciting topic. Then Eva about the role of addressing people in the EPP and how the majority is. And Eleonora, I think, supported kind of the notion of European parties and also then European parties partnering with other countries like Japan, for example. So maybe Alberto, go in there.
Well, very briefly on the European parties, the party groups out there are voting. They're voting in bloc. They're voting in a homogeneous way, in an inconsistent way. I think, as I've been saying, historically, they've not been very homogeneous because they are basically a loose federation of national parties. They are not always very much ideologically aligned. It depends very much on the issue where they vote together or not together. But I would say it's a bit too early to say for the new European Parliament. I'm not able to tell you where the pattern is. We have been focusing very much on who is voting whom, as opposed to the uniformity of those individual votes. And these 4 votes I mentioned where we have seen the EPP voting in bloc with the far-right groups, the 3 far-right groups on the right, clearly caught our attention. Those were very symbolic votes at the beginning of the legislature, even before the formation of the commission, showing that actually it is possible for the EPP to actually side with these groups. And in the future, well, very difficult to say. The other interesting element that we have already highlighted is that virtually every single political group was pretty much split on the new European Commission, less on the right and on the extreme left. But otherwise, we could see that EPP, Socialists, Liberals, CCR, as we discussed, they split over this commission. They didn't agree on one of the most important possible decisions and vote, because this is the vote that gave this commission the possibility to enter into force. The Greens were split, virtually everybody on the center left and on the center right. The very same EPP, I mean, you had 2 big national groups, right? You had the Spaniards, you had the French. I mean, there are not so many, but there are several that actually voted against their own candidate, their own, can we use this term, Spitzenkandidat? And this is kind of phenomenal. It tells you a lot about the lack of homogeneity existing within those political groups. But there are political scientists who are much better placed than me. I'm not a political scientist like Simon Hicks and others who are actually keeping track of every single vote of these political groups. And we're going to be looking at their findings in the coming weeks and months and see how much homogeneity, how much consistency there is in these political groups, whether something is going to change or rather the opposite. And I think we can all have a lot of hypotheses. We know that on the far right, we assume that these far right groups, they are really, really divergent. That's what we keep saying. But, they're voting together on so many votes. And my own theory of the past few months is really to argue that in the past, the incentives for these far-right groups to come together would be much higher than the disincentive to actually fight one another. Because when they come together, they acquire a lot of power and they can let certain very conservative policies go through, like we're going to be seeing possibly on the environmental and the climate space, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you, Alberto. I think that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you to our both two interpreters that did an excellent job again. I want to say we have one top question that I actually didn't ask from Sabine, because we actually doing our next webinar on it. I actually wanted to say this is the last webinar of Europe Calling in before Christmas, but it probably won't be, because Sabine asked a very important question. How does the new EU Commission relate to what's happening in Georgia right now, the country? And I think this is a super important question, Sabine. So we're gonna do a full webinar, likely next week or the week after, on what's happening in Georgia, the pro-democracy movements or pro-European movements there. And in a way, I think what's happening in Georgia is likely also kind of a small summary of what Alberto and we discussed with all of you. It's about really the role of the citizens and getting this European feeling. I mean, in a way, Georgia is very far away, and there are now for 7 days running people on the street that say, look, we don't want to be part of the Iron Curtain and Putin anymore, but we want to be European and we feel European. And I think this is really, one of the answers to what the political situation is in Europe right now is exactly that: getting people back on the streets, but also back into the political space and making it the European political space. So with that, I want to close and thank you all. Thank you, Alberto. Thank everyone who's been there and all the interpreters. And see you next time. Bye bye.
Thanks to you. Bye bye, everyone.